Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Lydia Jordan Parnell, and on behalf of Women of Willis, I would like to welcome you to today's program. To get things kicked off, and as a few more people start to join us, I wanted to do a quick check-in and kick things off with a poll. So we would like to know how many of you are attending a Women of Willis program for the first time? Responses. All right, and we'll go ahead and end that poll. I'll share those results. So we've got a lot of newcomers today, which is super exciting. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for a Women of Willis program for the first time. We at Women of Willis are a network supporting Women of Willis Tower comprised of people who work here in the tower. And the group endeavors to overall share best practices to help advance women in leadership positions, network with like-minded individuals, create a community of women from different companies within the building, and work towards sharing professional challenges and solutions, all while fostering mentorship opportunities. And so for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are back, it's good to see you again. And we encourage you to check out our website at willistower.com to learn more about our future programming. In just a few minutes, we are going to meet our guest speaker, Lori. But before I turn things over to her, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping items. Today's Zoom session is a Zoom webinar. So audio and video has been disabled for participants, but we do invite you to use our Q&A feature to send any questions you may have to the speaker during the duration of our talk. And we'll get to those questions at the later portion of our talk today. From a building perspective, and also today's session is going to be recorded. So the recording of today's talk will be made available following today's presentation. From a building perspective, we know many of you are still working from home, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the office soon. Please be sure to check out the Willis Tower app and subscribe to our e-newsletter, The 110, and also visit our website, willistower.com, for the latest on all return to office information. A lot has changed at the tower in the past several months, and if you're back in the office on an adjusted schedule and looking for a change of scenery, the outdoor terrace is now open on the 4th floor exclusively to Willis tenants. With social distance seating and Wi-Fi, it's a perfect place to enjoy those last few warm days of the year to take in lunch or work outdoors. And when you're back and settled, be sure to check out our Catalog Cares gift card program. When you buy gift cards to your favorite Catalog Cares restaurants, Willis Tower will match your purchase with a donation of Frontline Foods, who has, through their partnership with World Central Kitchen, been feeding community members in need for the past several months. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Lori Osborne. Lori is the director of the Evanston Women's History Project, a community-wide project to document the significant contributions Evanston women have made to the community. She also serves as the director of the Frances Willard House Museum in Evanston, Illinois. Osborne currently serves as on the board of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, or NCWHS, which works to increase the level of women's history interpretation at all historic sites. She is the Illinois coordinator for the Votes of Women Trail and is the NCWHS project, which is a NCWHS project in honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Suffrage Amendment. She also serves on the Women's Suffrage Anniversary Committee of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. Osborne holds a master's degree in English literature from the University of Chicago and a master's degree in public history from Loyola University. Thank you so much for joining us, Lori. I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Lydia. I'm gonna advance the slide here. Let's see, make sure I can do that. Yep, there we go. So thanks everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. and tell you a little bit of a story that most people don't know much about, which is the important role that Illinois women played in the women's suffrage movement. I've said frequently in the last couple of months, I'm so glad for many, many reasons that Ida B. Wells lived in Chicago, because the fact that she lived in Chicago means that people at least talk about Chicago and the women's suffrage movement. But if you've paid attention in the last few weeks at all to the suffrage story, you might not know how important Illinois and Illinois women in general were to this fight. So that's what we're going to cover a little bit today. It's a moment of great pride for Illinois, actually. So we should talk about this and share their stories. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background of what's been going on with the anniversary and me briefly. You can explore these websites that are here if you want to know more. This is the Frances Willard House. I'm actually speaking to you from the Willard House, the office here in this little Victorian cottage, exactly the opposite kind of building from the Willis Tower that I can imagine. So that's the Frances Willard House. That's Frances Willard on the left there. And I also direct the Evanston Women's History Project, which is at evanstonwomen.org. We have lots of information if you're wanting to know more about Frances Willard, the temperance movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which she ran, and all the different other Evanston women who were very, very important to the suffrage movement, including Willard, nationally and internationally. I also was the editor and coordinator for one of the main websites that covers the suffrage story in Illinois, Suffrage 2020 Illinois, with lots of information about the movement in Illinois. If you want to know more than I'm going to talk about today, you can go there. There are upcoming programs and things going on as the suffrage anniversary kind of continues. They'll be celebrated, the big anniversary, on August 26th. Things are coming up. So if you want to see more of the story, please explore these websites and you'll find more. There's actually a program this coming Thursday that we're doing in partnership with Hull House about African American women in the suffrage movement, and a new book that's coming out this week, that came out last week, written by Martha Jones. So if you want to know more about that and go deep with a really important scholar on that topic, go to the Willard House website and you'll find a way to register for that program on Thursday evening. And then, as Lydia mentioned, I am on the board for the National Collaborative, and we're working on the National Votes for Women Trail. We have 50 or so suffrage sites in Illinois already on this map. And 5 of them will have historic markers placed at their locations when we can all do such things as have marker installations and gatherings. So if you want to know more about the national suffrage story, which happened all over the United States, including in Illinois, you can go to that website and find out more. So without further ado, though, let's get to the Illinois story. When Illinois enters the Union in 1818, its constitution, like those of the other 20 states at the time, expressly gave the vote only to white male inhabitants above the age of 21 years. And the second constitution reaffirmed that exclusion and restriction, and was adopted in 1848. There were a few more white male inhabitants who got the vote in those years, but it was still excluded from women. That same year, the first Women's Rights Convention, the convention that we call the first Women's Rights Convention, was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And that is where they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments and called for women's right to vote. And this was considered quite a radical thing to request, to ask for. And there are lots of women's rights mentioned in the Declaration of Sentiments, which is modeled after the Declaration of Independence. But the women's right to vote was one of the few that didn't get unanimous support, even at this first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. So, so these are important milestones in the earliest pre-suffrage movement history in Illinois. We really date the first active suffrage work in Illinois to 1855, when in a small town called Earlville, west of Chicago, there was the first women's suffrage speech and the formation of the first suffrage organization. Earlville is in LaSalle County, and a cousin of Susan B. Anthony's was living in Earlville at the time. Susan Hoxie Richardson lived there. There also was the support of the editor of the Earlville newspaper called the Earlville Transcript. And he was an abolitionist, and the abolition movement, the temperance movement, and the suffrage movement were kind of companion movements at this time. Many people who were involved in one or the other were involved in all three of them. And that was true for a lot of people. So if you were an abolitionist, typically you would have supported temperance and women's rights as well. So this is the first time we see suffrage really active in Illinois, but it is in 1868 that we start to see the founding of the women's suffrage organizations and the movement really starting to grow. There's a convention that's held in Chicago in February of 1869. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone, all three very prominent suffragists in the United States, come to Chicago for these conventions, the founding conventions, and the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association is formed. So this is just after the Civil War has ended, and this is when you really start to see the suffrage movement gaining some ground. The national suffrage movement is very sharply divided in these years following the war over issues and strategies. And one of the big divisions is over whether African American men should be granted suffrage in the 15th Amendment. Some suffrage activists believe that the way to say, also another point of division is that they divide over whether or not to take a state-by-state approach or pursue a national amendment that grants women suffrage. And so there are actually two national suffrage organizations in these years, one called the American Women's Suffrage Association and the other the National Women's Suffrage Association. They aren't joined together until 1890. So for almost 20 years, little over 20 years, there are two organizations. Of course, this division doesn't help them grow. And it's a real challenge for the national organizations to grow in these years. A key figure at this time is Frances Willard. Frances Willard is based in Evanston, working in Illinois on temperance and many other issues. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded in 1874, and she becomes president in 1879. And the organization quickly grows to be one of the largest organizations of women in the world under her leadership. While the women's suffrage movement is divided, the women's movement is not divided over temperance, and many, many women flock to temperance as a place where they can both work on issues their communities face and address issues that they feel is important. Willard, when she becomes president of the WCTU, quickly moves to get the organization to join her in supporting women's right to vote. This makes the WCTU really the largest suffrage organization at the time, working both in the United States and eventually around the world. So her work for suffrage really causes a lot of women to join the movement. She takes a somewhat what we might call a more traditional approach to persuading women to join. She really feels that women should join because they can use their votes to both better their communities and better the world and work to support things like temperance in their towns. The earlier movement really focused on women's rights and their natural right to the vote, and following sort of the early work on the Declaration of Independence and other work on natural rights movement. But Willard's support of suffrage and the WCTU's support of suffrage really brings out a significant anti-suffrage group, and that would be the brewers and the distillers, who certainly don't want women voting for prohibition, even if it's only on the local level. So eventually the temperance movement and the suffrage movement stay connected, but there's some division between the two about whether or not temperance really should be the goal or suffrage should be the goal. So in Illinois, back to Illinois, in the 1890s, we start to see the movement really growing and changing. Women are joining women's clubs. The women's club movement starts to grow dramatically in the early 1890s. The Illinois Women's Suffrage Association changes its name to the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association. Women in 1891 in Illinois are granted the right to vote for school boards and school elections. This the strategy to gain women a partial vote in Illinois is a really important focus. Illinois sort of develops the idea that there's a wedge strategy for gaining women the right to vote. Women in Illinois sort of strategize around, do we just try to get the door open slightly, and with one vote, voting for school board, we will gain additional voting rights. And this is the effort that is tried here, and it actually succeeds here, which I'll talk about in a minute. A key figure in these years is Catherine Waugh McCulloch, also from Evanston, and Catherine is the architect of this partial ballot strategy. She sort of focuses on studying the Illinois Constitution and the laws in Illinois about that influence women's rights, not just on voting, but on many rights, including rights to their own wages, rights to their children in divorce, custody battles. So McCulloch studies the Illinois Constitution, and what she realizes is that the Illinois Constitution actually doesn't prohibit women from voting on all elections, just some of them. So she decides to write a bill that will go to the legislature to grant women the right to vote in all the elections the Constitution doesn't prohibit. You don't need to change the Constitution to give women the right to vote. Some elections are available to women already in the Constitution if the legislature will grant them that right. One of the key things that is not prohibited in the Illinois Constitution is women voting for presidential electors. And as we know, when you're voting for presidential electors in a national election, you're actually voting for president. So McCulloch drafts the legislation, brings it to the legislature for the first time in 1893, and carries it to the legislature for 20 more years. And eventually it passes, but I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So this time period is critical. The 1890s into the early 20th century sees a lot of change for Illinois women. It also sees a lot of change nationally. Here's a little bit about what it looks like nationally in these years. Wyoming Territory and Utah Territory established the right to vote as territories. And Wyoming, when it becomes a state, continues women's right to vote in their state constitution. Colorado is part of Wyoming territory originally. Colorado does the same thing, as does Utah and Idaho and Washington and California and Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona. So you can see some of it happens in the 1890s, and then there's a big gap. And then in 1910 and 11 and 12, you start to see the acceleration of the progress. Illinois, get to the next slide. So in 1909 and in the early 20th century, things start to change in Illinois, and you really start to see a new approach being developed. This municipal suffrage bill, they're figuring out whether or not in the Chicago City municipal guidelines, whether or not women can be granted the right to vote just in Chicago by itself. It doesn't pass, but this work on municipal suffrage really galvanizes groups of women in Chicago around the idea of suffrage. And these are not just women in the women's clubs. This is women in the labor movement. Women across the city become women in immigrant groups. Women across the city sort of work together around municipal suffrage. And this becomes important in the years following. A woman named Grace Wilbur Trout of Oak Park becomes president of the Chicago Political Equality League and then of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association. And she kind of brings a new approach and a new strategy. She's a slightly younger generation, kind of with new ideas around how to get this done. And Trout is also she's a member of the sort of prominent women's groups in Chicago. Her husband is a prominent businessman in the city. So she also has connections, and she knows how to network. So that ability to tap a whole other media support and is important. She also is really interested in new approaches that are much more visible for the suffrage movement. So this is the era when you start to see parades and banners and buttons and all that sort of suffrage, the suffrage look that we all are kind of familiar with. And lots of things happen with this new strategy in these years. And it really does change the profile of the movement. So in Illinois, in 1913, that bill finally passes that McCulloch has taken to the legislature every year for 20 years. And Illinois becomes the first state east of the Mississippi to give women the right to vote. Now, it's true, that is a partial vote. It isn't all elections that take place in the state, but it's a really powerful vote because there are many women in Illinois in the next presidential election who are voting for president. There are many African-American women in Illinois and Chicago who are voting for president in 1916. And this gives Illinois women national power. It also makes all the other states wake up and pay attention. It's not an accident that New York women get the right to vote in 1917, a year after Illinois women are voting, and other eastern states quickly start to recognize they don't want just Illinois women voting for president. The other Western states that we saw don't have as many people living in them. So even though they had the vote earlier, the power doesn't show up. They're not influencing elections the way Illinois women are. So this moment is really critical. And one of the things that people don't realize, this 1913 vote is why it only is 6 years later that 19th Amendment finally gets passed. So in January 1913, there's the critical story that happens right before June of 1913 is when that law passed. In January, Ida B. Wells forms the Alpha Suffrage Club for African American women in Chicago. And it is a networking organization that helps really establish Wells though Wells has been working in the suffrage movement for many years, this Alpha Suffrage Club becomes kind of the locus of all of her work. She travels to Washington, D.C. for the suffrage parade that's held there. The first national suffrage parade is held in March of 1913, and Wells travels to D.C. with the Illinois delegation to march in the parade. And it's at that parade that we really start to see a critical racial divide surface. Illinois' delegation is not a segregated delegation, but when it arrives in Washington, D.C., it's asked to segregate itself and to have Wells march at the end of the parade with other African American women. And Wells refuses to do this. And the debate around this for the Illinois delegation is really critical. It reveals a real division both in Illinois that carries forward, but really on the national level, that is dividing the suffrage movement. The women in southern states and many northern states aren't working together across race lines to attain the vote for all women. And Wells points out the hypocrisy of this division and refuses to allow it to happen to the Illinois delegation. There's lots more about this on the website. It's really a fascinating story of what happens. And Wells, of course, is a pioneering journalist, anti-lynching activist, civil rights activist, working on so many issues in Chicago. She's actually born a slave in Mississippi and grows up in Memphis. After the Civil War, she becomes a teacher. She becomes active in many, many other movements, but settles really in Chicago as the locus of her work, as the African American community in Chicago really starts to grow in the 1890s and 20th century. It becomes a powerhouse, and Wells is part of that, that community and really advocating for African Americans' rights far beyond just Illinois. So critical figure in this time period, and really establishes Illinois in the story. And I'll wrap up really quickly with these two suffrage parades that happen and the election in 1916. As I mentioned before, such a critical moment. We have two suffrage parades that happen, one in 1914, one in 1916 on Michigan Avenue. We're working actually to have a marker placed on Michigan Avenue. So much suffrage activity happened up and down Michigan Avenue, including the founding of the National League of Women Voters at the Congress Hotel. But in June of 1919, the 19th Amendment is finally passed. It's sent to the states for ratification, and Illinois is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Wisconsin is 1 hour behind Illinois, and Michigan is also ratifying it on June 10th. But you can tell why Illinois would be first. Given all this history I've just said, Illinois women were ready for that ratification. And it's finally ratified, fully ratified and added to the Constitution on August 26th of 1920. And women are voting in that fall election that year. So I'll finish there, and I'm happy to take questions or comments or anything. Let me stop sharing my screen. And I hope I'm on time, Lydia. I wasn't able to see the clock. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more and share any other information anyone would want to know.
Thank you so much, Lori. I just have to say that I learned a lot in this past couple minutes that you spent sharing the history. It's so exciting as a Chicagoan to hear about how Illinois led the way in bringing milestone accomplishment in civil rights to the country. So I know I feel energized, and it's also very rewarding to hear about the power of women coming together networking and moving the needle forward and kind of being the change that they want to see, which is very encouraging for Women of Willis, a network of women here at the Tower that has a lot of goals, I think, in line with some of the original goals of those that came before us and made this impressive change happen here in our great state. I do have a couple questions here that have come through.
Great.
And this is kind of something we were talking about as we were preparing for this talk. There are actually a lot of parallels between the time when the suffrage movement was gaining momentum and today. The Spanish flu was kind of running rampant 100 years ago. There's a lot of kind of civil unrest around social injustices happening. And, you know, there's a lot of layers there, but it would be interesting to hear your take on what lessons we thought we learned and then perhaps didn't, given the state of the world now.
Yeah, the parallels are kind of a little eerie in some ways from 100 years ago. The fact that there's a flu raging and suffragists have to adjust their work and wear masks to go to meetings, just like we have to. There is, and yes, 1919 is a terrifying year. What happens in Chicago with the race riots that year, it's really, really tough history to read about. So, but it's important for us to understand that, and just like we need to know this and realize really in some ways we've come a long way, however much work we still need to do. Those networks, suffragists are building networks. This is a 70-year battle for women's suffrage. So those networks are built, they come apart, they get rebuilt and remade. The thing that carries them through is that they don't give up on the goal. They believe so firmly in that these rights they deserve and they should be exercising their full citizenship, that their voices are important and they should be heard at the polling place, that they just stick it out. And that's the thing that's so incredible. This happens over the lifespan, and many women do not see the fruition of their work in their lifetimes. So, I think we can take heart that we're in this for the long haul. You know, if there's a cause you're working on, you may not see it all come together quickly and right in the time frame you imagine, but you need to stay with it. You know, if it's important and you put your time and effort into it, don't give up. Yeah,
that's super encouraging. A 70-year battle. I think that, you know, reading and listening about the suffrage movement, it didn't resonate with me that it was this long a time coming. So for some of the suffragettes that did get to see the vision come to life, what came next after August 26, 2020? What kind of work did the suffragettes move on to do?
Yeah, so in many states, you know, all of our voting rights comes from our states. So in many states, the restrictions on women voting, especially women of color voting, and they were put in place, they stayed in place. The 19th Amendment didn't alter that or secure voting rights for everyone across all women across the United States. So it is a fight that continues. You know, it's important to know how critical this was, that this was added to the Constitution, but not to forget that it wasn't over and that the work on voting rights continues today. It's not like it's over today. And it was an issue from the beginning of the United States, and it's a constant thing. It's something we need to work to protect and to secure, and then sometimes we need to go back to the drawing board and protect and secure it again. So yeah, 1920 is important, but it's certainly not the end of the story. Lots of work happens after 1920. Yeah.
Absolutely. You speak about kind of this work that's done after 1920, and there's still work being done today. But kind of taking a look at the other side of things, what are some elements of today's world that you think would make some of the suffragettes you spoke about proud today?
Yeah, there's so many ways that our rights are much more secure. Certainly women, I mean, we don't have an equal rights amendment, so that's something that many suffragists turned right away to working on the equal rights amendment. But there are other ways that our women's rights are more secure than they were in these years. You know, so there are many, I think that the suffragists would see a lot of progress from their time, especially women working, women in careers. It's not perfect. There's no question that there's discrimination and issues that women face that they shouldn't, but it's certainly much more advanced than it was in their time. The restrictions, especially on education and career development and working life. I mean, we're talking, you know, real challenge from 100 years ago to be a woman in the world and to seek your own voice and life. So I would say we've come far, but we have work to do.
Absolutely. Taking another look back into the past and that August 26th date, 1920, we talked a little bit about this, particularly kind of Ida B. Wells' role. And we know that there were quite a few notable African-American women at the helm of the suffrage movement. Was the August 26th date a victory for them too, or did a lot of them kind of see those benefits come later on for that community?
It really depends on where you lived. I mean, as I said in the talk, African American women are voting and vote in droves as soon as that 1913 law is passed. So it's really quite remarkable. Wells is well aware of this new power. She mobilizes the Alpha Suffrage Club. There is lots of work happening in Chicago. African American women use that right and use it well. That's not to say they don't face restrictions in Illinois, and certainly face a lot of restrictions, especially in southern states. But that doesn't prevent anybody from working and fighting for that right and to protect it when it's threatened. So yes, there's no question that African American women face different issues than white women, and often white women don't function as allies the way they really probably should have, because when someone's rights are threatened, really everyone's rights are. So there's lots of misunderstanding in places, but there's also moments where everybody is galvanized and working together. That certainly happens in Illinois. So
that's very exciting. That's very exciting to hear and to kind of see how this has come together. We got a couple other comments, just people who enjoyed the chat today and would love to see the recording, which we will make available after the talk. And also some questions about some of the resources that you shared with us today. And I know we have a post-event communication scheduled to go out, and we'd love to load it up with any resources that you feel would be best for people to dive in a little bit more. But do you have, just kind of off the top of your head, some resources, books, and other things and resources that might be good to check in on following today's discussion?
I'm right in the middle of the new book that I mentioned that came out last week. It's called Vanguard, and I can't remember the whole title, by Martha Jones. It's really fun. It's got a good story, really important story, and it's a little bit of a personal story. So that's the talk on Thursday night. The one that I usually mention is a good place to start is a book called The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss. It's a good story. It focuses on the end of the suffrage movement and how the final ratification, Illinois is first to ratify the 19th Amendment. Tennessee is the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment and puts it over the top. And the story of what happens in Tennessee is really, it's a dramatic story. It's an interesting story, but she sort of lays out the whole story of how you get to Tennessee. And I recommend that book as a good sort of way to get into the story and learn a lot. There's a lot of information. You can skip over all the names and the dates if you want to, and just sort of get to the flow. But it's good, yeah. And there's more on that Illinois Suffrage 2020 Illinois. There's a bibliography there, lots to read about, and more detail about the story that I shared.
That's awesome. Just such a rich history, and so exciting to hear Chicago and Illinois' unique role. You don't hear about that very often.
I know.
So I know I learned a lot today. I hope that our participants learned a lot today as well. And we, again, will be following up with the recording of today's talk if you didn't get to see it all the way through, or if you want to share it with friends, family, and colleagues. And also sharing along some of the resources discussed in today's presentation. I'm not seeing any further questions come through, but we can then go ahead and sign off here. But thank you all for participating. Thank you, Lori, so much for your time today chatting with us.
Yeah,
and I hope everybody has a great rest of their afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.